So on July 4th, 1795, there was a fireworks display, and it was attended by some American soldiers, including a guy named General Anthony Wayne, and a number of natives representing several different tribes: Delaware, Ottawas, Potawatomis, Ojibways, Miamis, and others. So a couple of the natives, they were interested in the fireworks, but they also complained that there wasn't enough wine. So one of them, a native named Legree, or the Gray One, he complained that the wine that they were giving out for the celebration, the bottles were too small. And they said since it had been raining, they needed bigger ones. But other natives were concerned about bigger issues at this conference, which was called the Treaty of Greenville. One of them was a Miami chief named Little Turtle. He had arrived a couple weeks earlier, and he had hoped to be the spokesman for the assembled natives at General Wayne's camp. And he was upset about the lack of unity displayed by the representatives of different tribes. Little Turtle was very concerned that all the tribes represented at the Treaty of Greenville were in a vulnerable position. 1 year earlier, General Wayne had defeated a multi-tribal native army at a battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And what Little Turtle was concerned about was that some of these other natives would give away too much land in treaty negotiations and reduce their ability to be sovereign and increase their dependence on the United States. Some of the natives were willing to trade huge blocks of land for essentially foodstuffs and alcohol, and Little Turtle wanted to avoid that. What some of the natives also wanted was payments. They would trade land, and in return, the U.S. government would give them annuity payments. Little Turtle did want some of that, but he wanted to keep as much land as possible. He was strongly opposed to American claims to lands north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, ever since they had defeated the British in the American Revolution. Little Turtle pointed out to Wayne that none of the tribes had ever ceded the Ohio lands to anyone, and so how could Americans claim them? In the end, though, Wayne was more successful. He was able to play the tribes against each other. So now we see a phenomenon that's going to become more and more prominent, in that instead of the natives playing European powers against each other, now you have Americans playing native powers against each other. The Treaty of Greenville was signed in August of 1795, a month later, and it said that the tribes would give up all of their claims to the southeastern two-thirds of Ohio, as well as a small slice of southeastern Indiana. It also gave the American government permission to set up military posts at several strategic locations that had once been French forts. What became Fort Wayne, Michilimackinac in northern Michigan, and what became Chicago. So in exchange, the government promised that the natives would get annuities of a certain amount for giving up their land. Then there would be a decent tract of land saved for the natives that they could, quote, enjoy for their hunting, planting, and dwelling therein, so long as they please, without any molestation from the United States. Now, this is going to be, unquote, this is going to be another problem, that the U.S. would make numerous treaties like this and not fulfill their side of the agreement. Little Turtle also knew that no matter what the government said, General Anthony Wayne was representing the government of the United States, but Little Turtle knew that the government didn't always control the people out in the frontier, the American settlers, who a lot of them couldn't even read. They wouldn't read these treaties, and they would still attack the natives, and then the government would do nothing. And then when the natives fought back against attacks from the frontier settlers, the government would say, well, we've got to protect our people, which are the settlers, and you're attacking them, so we're going to push you out, even though the natives were retaliating for Americans breaking an American treaty. This kind of struggle for autonomy was going to be a big problem going forward, and the Americans got the upper hand against a lot of different native groups in this era. This was a crucial time in the years after the American Revolution and before the American Civil War, in which the natives east of the Mississippi and in what's now the Midwest area, they lost a lot of their autonomy. Some natives handled things different than others. So there were some native leaders. One of them was a Seneca chief named Handsome Lake. The Iroquois, which the Seneca were part of the Iroquois League, they suffered very badly from the American Revolution, were displaced from a lot of their homelands in what's now New York State, and many of them had retreated to parts of Canada. There were some natives, among them Handsome Lake, who thought that, okay, the way we maintain our status as a people is by accepting some of these changes and not fighting back so much. A number of Iroquois did not want to change their life ways the way missionaries wanted them to. So increasingly, you got more and more missionaries going out to the natives. This was part of what was called the Civilization Project, which was a goal of the Americans and Canadians to some extent to quote unquote civilize natives, which meant change the way they lived, get them to live in nuclear family units instead of the matrilineal extended family units that a lot of them lived in, and get them to farm instead of hunt, and get them to convert to Christianity away from their native religions. So Handsome Lake, who was Corn Planter's half-brother, Corn Planter was the Iroquois leader who supported the Americans in the American Revolution, which is in the video that I'll post. Handsome Lake experienced a series of visions in 1799 in which he said that spiritual messengers came to him and told him that the tribe should renounce alcohol, that they should return to seasonal rituals. And he said that in these visions, he claimed to have visited both heaven and hell. And they also met with George Washington and Jesus. And they provided him a code which forbade sexual promiscuity, gambling, and spousal abuse. He remained a strong proponent of traditional Seneca religious beliefs. The modern Iroquois Longhouse religion is still shaped by some of the efforts that he had. So what he did was remake some of the Iroquois religion into something that accepted some of the Christian restrictions, but did not actually become Christian. This was a way to revitalize, he thought, his people. And so it gave them more independence, where they didn't submit themselves to missionaries or submit themselves to American agents, but also behaved in such a way that was less antagonistic to the white people around them. It did change a lot of the ways Iroquois worked, so it weakened women in their society. Women had been kind of the leaders of families and the leaders of towns, and this was an adoption of a much more patriarchal system similar to what the Americans had. That was a significant change to their culture. Others who wanted to revitalize their nations decided to take more aggressive action, and among those were the Red Stick Creeks. The Creeks actually had been in a civil war over the Civilization Project. An American agent named Benjamin Hawkins had been sent to the Creeks, who lived in kind of Alabama, Mississippi, southern Tennessee, that area. The Upper Creeks rejected Hawkins' efforts, but they quarreled among themselves, and some of them wanted to fight back against the Americans. The Lower Creeks, though, accepted, the ones who lived closer to Georgia, they accepted more of Hawkins's efforts. And so what he was trying to do was encourage them to give up their tribal ways, settle nuclear families on individual farms, and sell the U.S. a bunch of land. That was the goal. Sell them for nothing, pretty much. And in return, the U.S. will facilitate some of these farm homesteads. So that was the deal, which wasn't really a very good deal. The Red Stick Creeks were the ones who wanted to aggressively push back, and so they engaged a rebellion in which they attacked a fort in 1813. In retaliation, over the next year and a half, the U.S. sent a militia general named Andrew Jackson to pacify the area. The warfare ended the next year when Andrew Jackson led 1,500 Americans, 500 Cherokee, and 100 pro-American Lower Creeks against the main Red Stick town, which was on the Tallapoosa River. The remaining Red Sticks fought as well as they could, but they were defeated, and the next month, Andrew Jackson forced the Creeks to sign what was called the Treaty of Fort Jackson in August of 1814. Jackson was always kind of full of himself. The fort was named after him. And that treaty transferred 20 million acres of southern Georgia and central Alabama to the United States. Ironically enough, what was ceded was a lot of land that was occupied by the Lower Creeks, who had actually supported the Americans. But that didn't matter. The Americans did what they felt was benefiting them. What this meant was even when Indians would fight with Americans against their own people who were fighting back, that didn't guarantee that their land would be preserved. So tribes could not depend on the goodwill of the American government. So this is a period in which a lot of Americans say was the end of the beginning of this portion of Native American history in which natives were sovereign nations that had to be dealt with like nations diplomatically. That started to end. The lack of British assistance took away a lot of the leverage natives had, and that made it more difficult to resist. Some natives started looking at non-military options. And then there was the rise of manifest destiny, which is an extremely dangerous ideology for Native Americans. It was the idea that the United States had a destiny to overspread the continent. Well, who's occupying still 3/4 of the continent were various Native American tribes. And the Americans started to look at all of them as simply people in the way of this destiny that need to be dealt with one way or the other, and either contained or removed. So one of the more valiant resistance movements was fought by two brothers who were called Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, and I'm going to have a video or a documentary that talks about them. Essentially, they were Shawnee and originally occupied various parts of the Ohio country, and then because of the Treaty of Greenville, they were pushed into Indiana. Tecumseh never recognized the legitimacy of the Treaty of Greenville and wanted to take back parts of Ohio for his own people. What Tecumseh believed in, which the film is going to talk about, was really quite innovative, and not many Native leaders had this type of idea, but Tecumseh wanted to create a Native nation state. He was one of the few Native leaders that understood that the nation state idea was so important to white people. If he could create a unified Native nation state, a United States of Natives, so to speak, that existed in the Northwest. And so where this Native nation state would be most of what's today the upper Northwest: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. What Tecumseh wanted to accomplish was a linking of all the tribes in all this area, and then ally them with the British. And the British would supply weapons and supply money and guarantee their independence against the Americans. So obviously the Americans saw this as a great threat. And the way Tecumseh saw is the way he thought he could tie different Native peoples together who didn't usually get along was through a religious movement that his brother was leading, which is one of these revitalization movements to reject alcohol and things like that, kind of similar to Handsome Lake, except this one was quite spiritual. This effort actually worked better than the Americans expected, and it freaked Americans out. And so they engaged a preemptive attack on the capital of this attempt at a nation state. It was called Prophetstown in what's now Indiana. And that caused Tecumseh to then side with the British in the War of 1812. He was killed in that war. he was quite a remarkable individual, and your film's going to talk about this episode in which he gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, where the British, and again, even the British couldn't be counted on by natives. The British had been supporting Tecumseh, and Tecumseh had been fighting with them. And then the tide of the war kind of turned against the British a little bit by 1813. The British are like, okay, we're going to pull back and just protect our settlements in Canada. And Tecumseh was like, wait, you can go back there, but where can we go? I mean, this is our home we're fighting for here. And the British are like, we're going to go back. And Tecumseh gives this amazing speech in which he says, if you're going to go ahead and go and be cowards, but at least leave us your guns. And so we can pick up the fight from here. The British didn't do that. Tecumseh ended up trying to still fight for that territory in the Midwestern frontier, and he ended up being killed. And that ended the loss of a charismatic leader like that ended the effort to create a native nation state. His brother Tenskwatawa was eventually removed and lived out his life in Iowa, where at that time was part of Indian country that the Americans removed the eastern tribes to. And so the defeat of the Red Sticks and of Tecumseh's coalition in the 18 teens marked a turning point for the tribes east of the Mississippi. Up until that point, natives had been able to rely on at least logistical assistance from other Europeans to stand up to American encroachment, what tribes called Americans the Long Knives. Instead, after 1815, most tribes east of the Mississippi no longer had this assistance. What was worse was that having ever sided with the British, now that the Americans have fought not one but two wars against the British in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, the Americans didn't forget that, and they saw the natives as their mortal enemies that needed to be dealt with. Someone who particularly thought this way about them was Andrew Jackson. This signaled a turning point between Native Americans and white Americans. The goal after this point was to either civilize the natives or get them out.